Some of you know that Bernie Glassman, my teacher's teacher, person I like to call my Dharma grandfather, suffered a stroke a little over 2 weeks ago. He's doing okay. It's a reminder, of course, how suddenly and drastically life can change, which is why every moment, which is all we have anyway, is very important to live as fully and as consciously as possible. A reminder how life can end, of course, at any moment. We're reminded of that today, too. You may realize that today is the 30th anniversary of the Challenger space shuttle explosion. So, sudden, complete change. But I left a message on Caring Bridge, that website, which sometimes people who are ill can receive messages and give reports. I told them, now you've joined the company of people like Ram Dass and Bede Griffiths, who were spiritual teachers who suffered strokes. And, well, obviously there are lessons there. And I'll share what both of those people said about their own experience. Because it's, to quote yesterday's Page a Day Zen calendar, which was by Hermann Hesse, he said, I've always been a seeker, he said, but I no longer ask questions of stars or books. He doesn't mean movie stars, stars or books, but I rather open myself to the teaching that my blood whispers to me. And that's, of course, what we're trying to do as we breathe, as we sit, so as we try to be awake. We awake in our bodies, through our bodies. And that's one of the lessons, one of the major lessons that sickness can teach us. And certainly one of the lessons that you'll see these men learned as well. Hopefully we don't need that to wake us up, but most of us are likely going to go through something like that anyway. Now, what is interesting, however, in this particular circumstances, it strikes me, with these examples, how many spiritual teachers, male spiritual teachers, and that's already interesting, do more men suffer strokes than women? It's my impression, but I don't know what kind of studies have been done on this, if any. But in the terms of spiritual teachers, men seem to go through this, and at least in the case of Bernie and of Ram Dass, and perhaps also of Bede, they're paralyzed on the right side, which means the left brain, which means it's that controlling, ego, managing, masculine side that has to go. That leads to further evolution. And they actually point that out, but I think that's a very fascinating phenomenon that's worth, maybe some further scientific study. Anyway, how many of you know Ram Dass or know of Ram Dass? Okay, that's good. He's is one of the LSD people at Harvard in the old days. Timothy Leary, and then he became, pursued his spiritual journey further through Hinduism and his own guru. Now he's in his 80s. He lives in Maui. I visited him there a couple of years ago, had a private conversation with him. He's quite a luminously radiant person now. But he had as he says, he had his stroke in February of '97. So he's lived almost 20 years. Going on 20 years with this condition. And he wrote a book. His famous book is Be Here Now, and this one is called Still Here. Still Here, embracing aging, changing, and dying. And he wrote this before his stroke, and he couldn't find an ending for it, and so the universe gave him an ending for it, which was his stroke. And it came on, he almost didn't realize what was happening. He realized his leg was not moving, and then his arm, and then he couldn't speak, was on the phone. He had quite a number of reflections, and one of the things he says that he'd learned, because I spent my adult life concentrating on the realms of the spirit, I'd always been able to rationalize the distance I maintained from my body by saying that my detachment was a spiritual witnessing of the physical form. But that had only been partly true. The truth is that I distanced myself from my body. I saw my body as merely a vehicle for the soul. I ignored it as much as possible and tried to spiritualize it away. Guys especially love to do that. That's why I say male spiritual teachers run the risk of this a lot more than female ones. And that's a mistake. Whether you're talking about Christianity with incarnation and resurrection, body is part of the ultimate reality, or whether you're talking about Mahayana Buddhism, we're talking about Zen, where emptiness is form and form is emptiness, and it's in and through the body. You don't take that distance from your body. It's a mistake. Psychologically, it's a mistake. Theologically, it's a mistake spiritually. So an experience like this can help you, wake you up, literally. And it certainly did in his case, as he says. Another thing that he has, this is interesting, he has aphasia. That is to say, he can think, but he can't formulate the words very easily. So he speaks a lot more slowly now, as I experienced for myself. But listen to what he says about that. People insisted that my halting new voice enabled them to concentrate on the silence between the words. So now that I speak more slowly, people tend to finish my sentences for me and thus to answer the questions for themselves, which is what they're supposed to do, right? So I once used silence as a teaching method, now it arises without my control as a teaching method. And it's a silence, it enables him to be more in the silence as well, one would think. At the end of this introduction, he says, recently a friend said to me, you're more human since the stroke than you were before. No greater compliment can be paid. So it's worth it. The last chapter of the book, the current and last chapter, this book was published in 2000. It's called Stroke Yoga. And it goes through quite a few of the things that he's learned and been learning through this experience. And says something to us as well. He said he'd been facing fears. We all face fears about aging, about sickness. And he says, I'm here to report that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He didn't make up that phrase, obviously, but he had in the actual experience of something that's so debilitating and then realizing, well, it's actually just life and it's just growth. So what's to be afraid of? That's a wonderful effect of it. It can happen. I'm less afraid, as he says. But then he repeats the fact that this stroke happened for many different reasons, but one of them is because I have been disregarding my body. So he repeats that here. And then it becomes, his own particular practice. The stroke grounded me, in both meanings of the word. It brought me in touch with the earth plane, with my body, and it made me stay more at home, in all senses of that word. Go deeper in that way. Because when there's not much a rush of words, the imagery gets subtler. And then he says, the effect of the change in the balance in my brain, with the left brain, the verbal analytical half less dominant since the stroke, maybe the right brain is just freer to come out and play, as I was intimating earlier. So he sees that as an effect. Then pain. Pain is a potent attention getter, he says here. What I've learned from all that, what a delicate game it is to work with intense pain. Like all the experiences of an incarnation, pain has to be experienced fully by the ego in order to be an effective learning experience for the soul. All right, so we're back to that. The soul can't go off on its own thing and say, well, I'm leaving the body behind and I'm doing my own thing. No. the only way you can really grow is through the experience of, well, the ego's experience of pain. Experience of pain. The only solution is to be on two planes at once. Emptiness and form, almost paradoxically. Both more intense. More intense body and pain, more intense soul. And they go together. You have to enter the pain fully, and yet be in the soul level at the same time. That's fierce, he says. You might have seen a documentary on his later life, which is actually called Fierce Grace. It's a phrase he uses here. It's fierce grace because it's grace, it makes you grow, but it's fierce. You know? Maybe that's the only way. If it weren't fierce, it wouldn't be real. It wouldn't be very deep. So he says you feel the full intensity of the pain, and at the same time, you transcend it by being in the witness state. A phrase that sometimes is used. Pain demands that you establish yourself simultaneously in ego and soul. What an incredible teacher it is. Emptiness and form at the same time. Never one without the other. If you have one without the other, you're not awake. And there's a peace that he began to feel in the midst of all that, and even the doctors and those around him noticed it. So the stroke hasn't turned out to be as bad as I would once have anticipated, he said. Another thing he brings up very much here, and I saw this in the 3 months between diagnosis and death in my mother's case, we siblings realize that part of what many people have to go through, and he says he did here, is the experience of dependence. You're dependent as a baby, then you become independent as an adult, and maybe too much so. And we're called to service, yes, to be giving, but we're also called, if we're going to be really awakened and humble and connected in all the ways we should be, we're connected not only to give, but to receive, to be dependent on others. That's very mature. To be objects of compassion and connection and humility and love, as well as those who give compassion and love. And that's a hard lesson to learn for controlling adults, to be able to receive that. And he realized that that's something he had to go through to be fully connected in as humble a way as our humanity requires. The word humble, it comes from the same. Human, the same word as human. Grounded. Ground. Humus. That was all part of what he had to learn too. So these were all teachings he got. What was changed was my attachment to the ego. The stroke was unbearable to the ego, and so it pushed me into the soul level to bear the unbearable. So there's a paradox here, because although I'm more in the spirit now, I'm also more human. Exactly. Maybe that's the whole point of sickness and suffering. Learn that. Cosmic universal scale. There's no fear of anything your incarnation can bring. So he says he's an ambassador, a scout of awareness now, than more than he ever was before. And faith and love are stronger than any changes, stronger than aging and stronger than death. Experienced. So how many of you have heard of Bede Griffiths? Fewer people have heard of Bede Griffiths. I'm not quite sure. This is a biography of him. A 20th century British Benedictine monk who spent many decades later in India in an ashram founded by Benedictine monks from Europe and became the abbot there. Now, the chapter in the autobiography that has to do with his stroke says, breakthrough to the feminine. So that's a major part of his own awareness, is that right brain comes more to the fore here, and that it was even an encounter with the feminine, the stroke itself. It happened on January 25th, 1990, so this week, 26 years ago. Now in his case, he didn't live that long afterwards. He died 2.5 years later. but still the experience was very powerful. And in his case, it wasn't, oh my God, I'm having a stroke. It was a sledgehammer to hit him on the head, shattering his brain, everything became blurred and confused. And then he slowly improved from there. So it struck him as, well, it struck him literally. I had blown my mind. He compared it to the Dark Knight. He used this Christian imagery, the Dark Knight of John of the Cross. The ego had collapsed. I feel totally free. All the barriers have broken down. I think I know now what the void of Buddhism is. Exactly. I am empty. And he says it's not a mystical experience, it's a negative experience. Well, I'm not quite sure he's right about that. You have to have that negative experience. As it says a little bit later, after his second stroke, just before he died, he felt very often he was not himself when he was being cared for by others. You know, in the midst of the pain, he would be irritable or resist and be like not himself. But you have to go through that too. It's not as if you become more and more perfect, more and more lightsome. That side of humanity is part of the humility that you have to go through. It's what Richard Rohr, who just went through a battle with cancer himself, called recently afterwardness. You only realize and become fully conscious of the spiritual benefit of what you're going through afterward. Not in the midst of it, where it can be very overwhelming and, quotes, disedifying, and, because it wouldn't have its effect if you were fully dominating it on some higher level. So there's no escape from the human experience as the vehicle for enlightenment. And that dependency thing, in the update today on Bernie's website, Bernie's Caring Bridge thing, it said the Bodhisattva who had become, Bernie likes to play the clown as part of his enlightenment, the Bodhisattva became a Bodhisattva. Well, it says today he's a baby sattva. He was like a baby, being cared for by others. Exactly. That's what we're talking about. So he entered the dark night. Even his heavenly Father, every image of a personal God had to go. So he entered that emptiness through it. Only then could he be one with the darkness, the void, the dark mother, who is love itself. So he and the Christians personalizes it, makes this darkness and the void the mother, and it's not false. It's just a way of articulating it, understanding it. Who is love itself? It's that compassion which comes through. So he experienced a month later. He was in this state, and the inspiration suddenly came to surrender to the mother. And I had experience of overwhelming love, waves of love sort of flowed into me. So it allowed him to enter into this void, which was then experienced as compassion and love, darkness, which is what it is. So this is what he said about it, or someone said about it. On January 25th, the mother came and struck him and wounded him. He saw it as an assault by, Kali, almost like the Black Madonna of Hinduism. And on the February 25th, the mother came and overwhelmed him with love and healed him. Ram Dass speaks about the difference between curing and healing. He wasn't cured from his stroke, but he was healed by it. So the mother came and healed him right in the midst of that. So Yago Barafik says, when talking about his stroke, he would stress that what he had felt as a blow on his head came from the left and propelled him towards the right. And this he interpreted as being a violent assertion of the feminine, the right side of the brain. So despite his early experience of God and nature, despite his longing for the intuitive, the feminine, and the unconscious, he had none of the less grown up in a patriarchal society, and all his life had lived in the intellect, developing the rational masculine side and suppressing the intuitive and the feminine. Now at last, in his 84th year, he felt the left brain and the whole rational system had been knocked down, And the right brain and the intuitive understanding, the sympathetic mind, had been opened up. So he was a Catholic monk, he was a male, and he was also a teacher, and so he was he was a Brit also. That's deadly. So he had to go through this experience in order to be fully awakened. That part had to die in order for him to wake up. And that's the way he felt. It's an encounter with the feminine. So the chaos is in God, we could say, and that is why discovering the darkness is so important. We tend to reject it as evil. The darkness is the womb of life. So these are ways in which these spiritual teachers experience this diminishment as being almost an essential part of the waking up process, in general, and certainly for them personally. So there's, in that sense, nothing to be afraid of. And I'm going to conclude with a little quote from Teilhard de Chardin. If you're familiar with his Divine Milieu, he has a whole section in there called the divinization of our passivities. There's the active side, but there's that passive side, and that's divinized as well. He calls it the divinization of our diminishment. So it's very much along these same lines. So I forget where I got this, who gave it to me. It's from the 1950s, in French, edition of his works. And preparing for this class, I had to cut the pages. In France, they publish it without cutting all the pages. So I was the first one to read this 60 years after it was published. Interesting. Anyway, what is time? So he says, and I'm going to try and just translate freely from the French. Read it in French would be better. But, so when from outside of me something comes upon me, or something from within is born within me, the evil which diminishes me and carries me away, at that painful moment where I realize that I'm sick or that I'm becoming old, at the very last moment especially where I sense that I'm escaping from myself, absolutely passive in the hands of the great unknown forces that have formed me, at these somber hours give me, God, to understand that it is you who are pulling apart the fibers of my being to penetrate into the very marrow of my substance to carry me away into yourself. Yes, the more that I feel in the depth of my flesh this sickness that is incurable and latching on to me, the more I become aware that it's you that I have within me, as a principle that's active and it's purifying and detaching me. The more the future appears before me as a dizzying crevice or an obscure passage, the more, if I trust myself to your word, that I can have confidence that I'm losing myself and burying myself in you, being assimilated to your body, O Jesus. O energy of my Lord, living in irresistible force, because of the two of us, you're infinitely stronger. It's your role to burn me up in the union which melts us together. So give me something that's much more precious than what most of your faithful ask of you. They often want to communicate while dying. To die while they're receiving communion. I want to communicate while dying, through dying. So nothing can happen to you that isn't a gift. And whatever brings you deeper into your own humanity, however painful it might be, or very, very precisely to the extent that it's painful, it's also literally a wake-up call to enter more deeply into it.